You know, a man's story is never what's printed on his name tag. The first thing anyone noticed about Frank Donovan was the ladle in his hand. Not his eyes. Not the old scar near his jaw. Not the quiet way he carried himself through the crowded mess hall at Naval Station Fairmont. Just the ladle. At 82 years old, Frank spent his weekdays serving lunch to sailors young enough to be his great-grandchildren. The lunch rush had hit hard that afternoon. The long line stretched nearly 40 yards across the polished floor, weaving between stainless steel counters and humming drink machines. Voices echoed beneath the high ceiling. Boots scraped against tile. Trays rattled. The smell of roast beef, mashed potatoes, and fresh coffee drifted through the air. Frank stood behind the serving station, wearing a simple white apron over a faded navy work shirt. His silver hair was neatly combed. His movements were steady, efficient, and calm. While everyone around him hurried, Frank never seemed rushed. He simply worked. Scoop. Serve. Nod. Repeat. Most people never looked at him twice. To the sailors passing through the line, he was just another civilian employee. Another old man earning a paycheck. Another face that blended into the background. Lieutenant Kyle Mercer saw things differently. 27 years old and recently promoted, Kyle carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed every room became more important the moment he entered it. Today mattered even more. Admiral Richard Hayes was scheduled to visit the base for an inspection tour. Every officer wanted to make a good impression. Kyle wanted to make the best one. He moved through the mess hall with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm, correcting tiny details nobody else cared about. A crooked chair, a misplaced tray, a sailor whose uniform sleeve was rolled half an inch too high. Each correction was delivered with sharp precision. Each order sounded louder than necessary. As he approached the serving line, his eyes settled on Frank. The old veteran was carefully placing mashed potatoes onto a tray for a young seaman. Kyle frowned. The portion looked slightly uneven. It was the kind of thing most people would never notice. Kyle noticed. He stepped forward immediately. "Sir," he said sharply, "that serving size is supposed to be exactly 6 ounces. The conversation around them softened. Several sailors glanced over. Frank looked up. His pale blue eyes remained calm. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I'll keep that in mind." Kyle expected resistance. He expected excuses. Instead, he found himself irritated by the old man's composure. "Keep it in mind," Kyle repeated. "This isn't a suggestion. Standards matter." Frank simply nodded and continued serving the next tray. The reaction somehow annoyed Kyle even more. Around them, the line continued moving. Conversations resumed. But a few sailors kept watching. There was something unusual about the old man. Not because of anything he said. Because of what he didn't say. Frank absorbed criticism the way an old oak absorbed rain. Without complaint. Without argument. Without visible reaction. Outside, a warm Virginia breeze pushed against the flags flying above the base. Inside, preparations for the Admiral's arrival intensified by the minute. Officers checked schedules. Chiefs reviewed assignments. Sailors polished surfaces that were already spotless. Yet through all the activity, Frank Donovan remained exactly where he had been all afternoon, standing behind the serving line, quietly filling trays, looking for all the world like a forgotten old man. And not a single person in that crowded mess hall had any idea that before the day was over, Admiral Richard Hayes would walk through those doors, see something no one else had noticed, and come to a complete stop. Lieutenant Kyle Mercer spent the next hour chasing perfection. At least that was how he described it in his head. Every polished surface, every aligned chair, every properly stacked tray felt like another step toward impressing the visiting admiral. The problem was that nothing ever seemed perfect enough. As the clock above the serving line crept toward noon, the tension inside the mess hall slowly tightened. Sailors moved faster. Civilian employees spoke more quietly. Even the kitchen staff seemed aware that somebody important would soon be walking through the doors. Frank Donovan noticed it all. He noticed the nervous glances, the hurried footsteps, the way young officers checked their reflections in stainless steel panels when they thought nobody was looking. He had seen similar scenes before. Different buildings, different decades, different uniforms. Human nature rarely changed. He continued serving meals without comment. A sailor thanked him for an extra spoonful of gravy. Frank smiled and wished him a good afternoon. Moments later, another sailor stopped to help an elderly kitchen worker lift a heavy supply box. Frank noticed that too. Small acts always mattered. Most people simply moved too fast to see them. Kyle returned to the serving line shortly before noon. This time he was accompanied by two junior officers who seemed eager to laugh at whatever he found amusing. They followed him closely, nodding at nearly everything he said. Kyle glanced at the serving station and immediately found a new target. "Mr. Donovan," he called out. Frank looked up from a tray he was preparing. "Yes, Lieutenant." Kyle tapped the edge of the counter. "Do you always move this slowly?" A few nearby sailors exchanged uncomfortable looks. Frank remained calm. "The line is moving fine." "That is not what I asked." Kyle folded his arms. "You know the Admiral's schedule is already behind. If this line gets backed up because someone cannot keep pace, that reflects on the entire facility." Frank nodded once. "Understood." The response felt almost impossible to argue with, yet somehow it irritated Kyle even more. One of the junior officers smirked. "Maybe we should get him a stopwatch." The other laughed. Frank continued serving lunch. "Scoop. Serve. Nod. Repeat." The joke died almost immediately. There was no reaction to feed it. Kyle stared at the old man for several seconds. The silence bothered him. Most people became defensive when criticized. Most people tried to explain themselves. Frank did neither. It was as if the comments simply passed through him without leaving a mark. The line continued moving. Trays slid forward. Boots tapped against the floor. Somewhere deeper in the kitchen, an industrial mixer hummed steadily. Then Kyle noticed something else. Hanging from a thin chain around Frank's neck was a worn identification badge. The plastic was old. The edges were scratched. The photograph had faded slightly with age. "Let me see that," Kyle said. Frank gently removed the badge and handed it across the counter. Kyle examined it. Everything appeared legitimate. Temporary civilian contractor. Food Services Division. Nothing remarkable. Nothing important. Exactly what he expected. Still, he seemed disappointed by the result. He handed the badge back. "You have been here a long time?" Frank clipped it onto his shirt again. "A few years." "Military before that?" asked one of the younger officers. Frank paused briefly. "A long time ago." The answer triggered a grin. "Everybody says that." Another officer chuckled. "Probably spent 4 years peeling potatoes, and now he gets veteran discounts for life." A few nearby sailors lowered their eyes. The comment landed poorly. Frank simply returned to serving lunch. Yet for the first time, Kyle noticed something strange. The old man's expression had not changed at all. Not a flicker of embarrassment. Not a hint of anger. Just the same steady calm. The kind that seemed earned rather than practiced. Outside, a convoy of black vehicles rolled onto the base grounds. The Admiral had arrived. Inside the mess hall, nobody realized that the most important moment of the day was already moving toward them with every passing second. The first wave of visitors entered the mess hall just after noon. Senior officers moved through the room with practiced confidence, while enlisted sailors straightened instinctively as they passed. Conversations became quieter. Chairs scraped less often. The entire building seemed to inhale and hold its breath. Lieutenant Kyle Mercer stood near the entrance, watching every detail. This was his moment. If the inspection went well, people would notice. If something went wrong, they would notice that too. He was determined to control every variable. Unfortunately for everyone around him, that determination had begun turning into something else. Frank Donovan continued working behind the serving line. He handed a tray to a young sailor and wished him a good lunch. The sailor smiled and thanked him. Frank moved to the next person. His rhythm never changed. The steady pace contrasted sharply with the growing tension spreading through the room. Kyle noticed it again. The old man's calm. It bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Most people became nervous when high-ranking officers arrived. Most people adjusted their behavior. Frank seemed completely unaffected, as if admirals and inspections belonged to another world. Kyle walked back toward the serving line. Several sailors immediately looked away. They recognized the expression on his face. He was hunting for another problem. "Mr. Donovan," Kyle called. Frank looked up. "Yes, Lieutenant." Kyle glanced across the serving station. "Where is your contractor authorization card?" Frank touched the badge clipped to his shirt. "Right here." "Remove it." Frank quietly unclipped the badge and handed it over. Kyle examined it again despite having already reviewed it less than an hour earlier. The line behind the counter slowed. People began paying attention. The two junior officers from earlier drifted closer. They sensed entertainment. Kyle turned the badge over in his hand. Interesting. Frank waited patiently. Interesting how somebody can work on a military installation and provide almost no useful information about himself. One of the younger officers chuckled. Maybe he is classified. Several people laughed. Frank did not. Kyle handed the badge back, but did not leave. Instead, he leaned against the counter. Tell me something, Mr. Donovan. What exactly did you do in the military? Frank attached the badge to his shirt again. Many years ago. That is not an answer. It is the answer I have. A few sailors exchanged glances. The response was polite, respectful, yet somehow final. Kyle felt heat rising in his face. He was not accustomed to conversations ending on someone else's terms. You know, one junior officer said loudly, my grandfather tells stories like that. Every time he talks about the military, he somehow becomes more important. More laughter followed. Frank simply picked up another serving spoon. Could be worse. The second officer added, at least he is not pretending to be some secret hero. The remark drew a few uncomfortable smiles. Nobody wanted to participate, but nobody wanted to challenge officers either. Frank placed vegetables onto a tray and slid it forward. The sailor receiving the meal looked embarrassed. The young man quietly thanked him and moved on. For a moment, silence settled over the line. Then something unexpected happened. Kyle reached toward Frank's sleeve. It was not aggressive, not threatening, just careless. The cuff of the old work shirt had folded slightly while Frank worked. Kyle tugged lightly at the fabric. You know what? Maybe we should check for secret tattoos too. A few officers laughed immediately. Frank froze for the briefest fraction of a second. Not from fear, not from anger. More like a man hearing an echo from very far away. Then the sleeve shifted. Just enough. A small section of faded black ink became visible near his forearm. The laughter continued for another second before curiosity replaced it. The symbol looked old. Very old. A weathered circle surrounding a simple star. Nothing flashy. Nothing impressive. Nothing that appeared important. Kyle smirked. Well, there it is. He pointed toward the faded mark. What is that supposed to be? Some biker club from the 1970s. More laughter followed. But this time Frank did not immediately answer. His eyes drifted downward toward the tattoo. For the first time all afternoon, the noise of the mess hall seemed very far away. The laughter lingered for a few seconds before fading into scattered murmurs. Dozens of eyes settled on the faded symbol visible beneath Frank Donovan's rolled sleeve. It was not impressive. It was not intimidating. Time had worn the ink until the edges blurred together. The circle looked uneven. The star at its center seemed almost ordinary. To most people in the room, it looked like nothing worth remembering. Lieutenant Kyle Mercer certainly thought so. He folded his arms and shook his head. That is it, he asked. I was expecting something dramatic. One of the junior officers leaned closer. Maybe it means he won a bowling tournament. A few nervous laughs followed. Frank remained still. His gaze rested on the tattoo. The sounds of trays sliding across metal rails. The hum of refrigerators. The distant conversations. All of it seemed to drift farther away. What does it mean? Kyle pressed. Frank lifted his eyes slowly. It means something to the people who wore it. The answer only encouraged more amusement. That sounds mysterious, one officer said. Maybe we should start calling you a legend. More laughter echoed through the serving area. Yet something about the exchange felt different now. The humor lacked confidence. Several sailors who had been watching earlier no longer looked entertained. They looked uncomfortable. The old man's calm had become impossible to ignore. Most people would have become angry. Most people would have walked away. Frank simply stood there with the same quiet dignity he had carried all afternoon. Across the room, Chief Petty Officer Ethan Ross entered through a side doorway carrying a clipboard. He had spent nearly 20 years in uniform. Long enough to recognize when a situation was heading in the wrong direction. He immediately noticed the unusual crowd gathered around the serving line. Sailors were lingering instead of eating. Officers were standing still instead of preparing for the inspection. Something had everyone's attention. Ethan approached slowly. What is going on over here? He asked. Kyle glanced toward him. Nothing serious, Chief. We are just learning about our mysterious cafeteria historian. More scattered laughter followed. Ethan's eyes shifted toward Frank, then toward the exposed tattoo. For a moment his expression did not change. Then something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition. Not complete recognition. More like a memory struggling to surface. Ethan had seen countless military insignias over the years. unit patches, qualification badges, squadron emblems. This symbol felt familiar in a way he could not explain. He stepped closer. Mind if I take a look? Frank studied him for a moment before gently setting down the serving spoon. Go ahead. Ethan examined the faded circle and star. The symbol stirred something deep in his memory. Hey, conversation. A briefing. A story told years ago by a retired Master Chief during a veterans event. He could not place it. Not completely. But his instincts suddenly became very alert. Kyle noticed the change. You recognize it? Ethan did not answer immediately. Maybe. The uncertainty in his voice drew attention. The room grew quieter. Ethan pulled out his phone. Not openly. Not dramatically. Just a quick movement. A single photograph. One image of the faded tattoo. Kyle laughed. Come on, Chief. You cannot be serious. Ethan slipped the phone back into his pocket. Maybe I am. Frank said nothing. His eyes returned to the serving line. Yet for the first time all afternoon, Ethan found himself studying the old man instead of the tattoo. The steady posture, the calm eyes, the complete absence of fear. Suddenly, the symbol seemed less important than the person wearing it. Across the base, senior staff were preparing to escort Admiral Richard Hayes toward the inspection route. Inside the mess hall, Ethan Ross quietly stepped away from the crowd. As he walked toward the side exit, his thumb moved across his phone screen. A photograph was sent. No explanation. No message. Just a single image directed to an executive assistant inside the Admiral's office. Ethan did not know exactly what the symbol meant, but every instinct he possessed told him one thing. Somebody important needed to see it. Frank Donovan stared at the faded circle and star on his forearm. For a moment, the bustling mess hall disappeared. The clatter of trays faded. The conversations dissolved into distant echoes. The smell of coffee and roasted meat vanished like morning fog. In its place came another memory. Not a battlefield. Not a firefight. Just rain. Endless rain falling through a dense canopy somewhere far from home. He was 21 again. Exhausted. Soaked to the skin. Sitting beneath a makeshift shelter built from canvas and determination. For other young men sat beside him. Mud covered their boots. Fatigue lined their faces. Yet despite the conditions, nobody complained. They were together. That was enough. One of them held a sharpened piece of metal. Another mixed dark ink in a small tin cup. There were no speeches. No ceremonies. No officers. No cameras. Only 5 young servicemen who had spent months relying on one another when nobody else could help. The circle came first. Drawn carefully. Imperfect but deliberate. Then the star. 5 points. One for each man sitting beneath that shelter. A promise more than a symbol. A reminder that no matter where life carried them afterward, none of them would ever forget the others. The mark was never official. It never appeared in regulations. No military handbook ever mentioned it. Yet it meant more to them than any paperwork could. Frank remembered the laughter that night. He remembered stories about hometowns scattered across America. Cornfields in Iowa. Fishing docks in Maine. Ranches in Texas. City streets in Chicago. 5 different lives connected by a shared experience that few people would ever understand. They had talked about the future. Families they hoped to build. Jobs they wanted someday. Places they dreamed of seeing. Young men always believed there would be time. The memory shifted. Years passed in seconds. Letters exchanged. Phone calls. Holiday cards. Then fewer letters. Fewer calls. Life moving in different directions. One by one, the names became memories. Not because they were forgotten. Because time always asks its price. Through it all, the tattoo remained. A simple promise carried across decades. Frank blinked. The memory dissolved. The mess hall returned. Bright lights reflected from polished floors. Sailors shuffled through lunch lines. Officers stood watching. Nobody around him knew where his thoughts had traveled. Nobody knew the names behind the faded ink. Lieutenant Kyle Mercer certainly did not. He still stood nearby, wearing the confident smile of someone convinced he understood the situation. Well, Kyle asked, what is the big secret? Frank looked at him quietly. There is no secret. Then why all the mystery? Frank glanced at the tattoo again. Because some things belong to the people who live them. The answer seemed to frustrate Kyle even more. Before he could respond, another sailor stepped forward with an empty tray. Frank immediately returned to work. Scoop. Serve. Nod. Repeat. The rhythm resumed as though nothing had happened. Yet something had changed. Several sailors no longer looked at the tattoo with amusement. They looked at it with curiosity. Respect, even if they did not understand why. Meanwhile, Chief Petty Officer Ethan Ross crossed the base parking lot beneath the afternoon sun. His phone remained silent in his pocket. He had almost convinced himself he was overreacting. Then the device vibrated. One message. No greeting. No explanation. Just 3 words from the Admiral's executive assistant. Call immediately. Ethan stopped walking. A knot formed in his stomach. The response had arrived far faster than expected. Much faster. He stared at the screen for a moment before pressing the call button. Suddenly, the photograph he had sent felt a lot more important than he had first imagined. Chief Petty Officer Ethan Ross pressed the phone against his ear as he stepped into the shade beside a maintenance building. The afternoon sun reflected off rows of parked vehicles, forcing him to squint. The line connected almost immediately. Chief Ross. The voice belonged to Commander Lisa Bennett, Admiral Hayes's executive assistant. Her tone was professional, but something beneath it sounded unusually tense. Yes, ma'am. There was a brief pause. Where did you get that photograph? Ethan glanced back toward the mess hall across the base. From a civilian employee working food service. Another silence followed. Longer this time. Chief, are you absolutely certain the image is authentic? Ethan frowned. It is a photograph, ma'am. I took it myself less than 10 minutes ago. He heard muffled voices in the background. Doors opening. Footsteps. Somebody speaking rapidly. The atmosphere sounded nothing like a routine office. What exactly is going on? Ethan finally asked. Commander Bennett lowered her voice. Stay where you are. Ma'am, the Admiral wants details. Everything. Ethan felt a chill despite the summer heat. The Admiral personally? Yes. The answer arrived instantly. No hesitation. No qualification. Ethan had worked around senior leadership long enough to understand what that meant. Something significant had happened the moment that photograph reached headquarters. Back inside the mess hall, Lieutenant Kyle Mercer remained convinced the situation was under control. In fact, he felt rather pleased with himself. The gathering crowd had given him an audience, and the old civilian worker still refused to offer any satisfying explanation about the tattoo. To Kyle, the entire thing felt increasingly ridiculous. The symbol was faded. The story was vague. The man wearing it spent his afternoons serving mashed potatoes. Whatever mystery people imagined simply could not be that important. You know what I think? Kyle said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. Frank Donovan continued preparing trays. No. A few sailors hid smiles. Kyle missed them completely. I think people love legends because reality is boring. Frank handed another tray forward. Maybe. The simple answer somehow irritated Kyle more than an argument would have. Across the room, several officers entered through the main doors to prepare for the inspection route. Conversations shifted toward the Admiral's expected arrival. Uniforms were adjusted. Postures straightened. The atmosphere became increasingly formal. Yet Frank remained exactly the same. Calm. Patient. Focused on the next person in line. Nearly a quarter-mile away, inside the administrative headquarters building, Commander Bennett hurried down a hallway carrying a tablet. She entered a conference room where Admiral Richard Hayes was reviewing inspection schedules with senior staff. The room fell quiet as she approached. The Admiral looked up. He was a tall man with silver hair and the composed presence of someone accustomed to command. What is it? Bennett placed the tablet in front of him. Sir, the individual from the photograph has been identified. Hayes glanced at the image. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his expression changed. Not dramatically, not visibly to most people, just a subtle tightening around the eyes. A stillness. The room sensed it immediately. Senior officers exchanged confused looks. Nobody spoke. Hayes stared at the faded symbol displayed on the screen. Then he looked at the accompanying personnel. File. One name. Frank Donovan. The Admiral slowly sat back in his chair. Years seemed to pass behind his eyes. Where is he? He asked quietly. Bennett answered immediately. Mess Hall 3, sir. Another silence settled across the room. One of the captains cleared his throat. Sir, is there a problem? Hayes never looked away from the screen. Cancel the next stop. Several officers blinked. The inspection schedule had been planned for weeks. Sir. Hayes finally raised his eyes. The calm expression remained, but something deeper had surfaced beneath it. Recognition. Memory. Disbelief. Cancel it, he repeated. Then he stood. Chairs shifted around the conference table as everyone rose automatically. Nobody understood what was happening. Nobody dared question it further. Across the base, Frank Donovan quietly served another lunch tray while an entire chain of command began moving in his direction. The news traveled faster than any official announcement ever could. Not because people were told, because people noticed. Officers who had spent the entire morning following a carefully planned inspection route suddenly began changing direction. Administrative staff hurried through hallways with unusual urgency. Radios crackled. Schedules shifted. Doors opened and closed. Something was happening. Nobody knew what. Inside the mess hall, the atmosphere had become strangely unsettled. Sailors whispered at tables. A few glanced repeatedly toward the serving line. Others watched Lieutenant Kyle Mercer, whose confidence remained completely intact. If anything, he seemed encouraged by the attention. He interpreted the growing curiosity as validation. People were watching. People were listening. In his mind, he remained the central figure in the situation. Frank Donovan continued serving lunch. His movements never changed. The same measured pace. The same quiet nods. The same polite greetings. It was almost unsettling. The entire base seemed to be shifting around him while he calmly scooped vegetables onto trays. Chief Petty Officer Ethan Ross returned through the side entrance and immediately noticed several sailors staring at him. They wanted answers. He had none he was willing to share. Not yet. Instead, he walked directly toward the serving area. Kyle spotted him first. Chief. Ethan stopped. Lieutenant. Kyle gestured toward Frank. You never told us whether you identified the tattoo. Ethan studied him carefully. I did not say I identified anything. Come on. Kyle smiled. You have been acting like it belongs in a museum. Several nearby sailors listened closely. Ethan glanced toward Frank. The old veteran appeared completely uninterested in the conversation. Sometimes, Ethan said quietly, the smartest thing a person can do is stop talking before they embarrass themselves. The words landed harder than a shout. A few sailors immediately looked away. Kyle's smile vanished. Excuse me. Ethan met his gaze. You heard me. For a moment, tension hung between them. Then a commotion near the entrance interrupted everything. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. The room seemed to shift all at once. A group of senior officers had just entered. Not one or two. Several. Captains. Commanders. Senior enlisted leaders. Their appearance alone was unusual. The fact that they looked focused on something specific was even more unusual. Kyle straightened immediately. Finally, he thought. The inspection. This was what he had been preparing for all day. Yet something felt wrong. The officers were not examining the facility. They were not checking cleanliness standards. They were not reviewing procedures. Instead, they scanned the room as if searching for someone. Their eyes moved across tables, across serving stations, across faces, then stopped. On Frank Donovan. Silence spread gradually through the mess hall. Conversations died one by one. Trays paused halfway to tables. Even the kitchen staff sensed the change. One commander whispered something into a radio. Another checked his watch. Nobody approached Frank yet. They simply waited. Kyle frowned. None of this made sense. Why would senior leadership be interested in a civilian cafeteria worker? Ethan Ross already knew the answer. Or at least part of it. Whatever photograph he had sent earlier had triggered something extraordinary. He watched the officers carefully. Their expressions were not curious. They were cautious, respectful, almost nervous. That realization sent another chill through him. Across the base, Admiral Richard Hayes exited headquarters and entered a waiting vehicle. The short drive would take only a few minutes. Yet nobody inside the convoy spoke much. Hayes sat quietly, looking out the window. In his hand rested a tablet displaying a faded photograph of a weathered tattoo. A circle. A star. A symbol most people would dismiss without a second glance. The Admiral studied it again. Then he looked at the name beneath the image. Frank Donovan. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he shook his head. Not in disbelief. In amazement. 40 years. 40 years since he had last heard that name spoken aloud. Outside, the convoy turned toward the mess hall. Inside, dozens of people waited without understanding why. And at the center of it all, Frank Donovan quietly handed another sailor a lunch tray and wished him a pleasant afternoon. The convoy arrived without sirens, without fanfare, and without warning. Yet the effect was immediate. Through the large front windows of the mess hall, Sailors spotted the black vehicles pulling to a stop outside. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to plates. Every person in the room instinctively recognized the significance of what they were seeing. Admiral Richard Hayes had arrived. Lieutenant Kyle Mercer felt a surge of satisfaction. This was the moment he had been preparing for all day. He adjusted his uniform, straightened his posture, and moved toward the entrance. Around him, officers did the same. The main doors opened. A pair of senior officers entered first, then Commander Bennett, then Admiral Hayes himself. The room rose almost as one. Chairs scraped against the floor. Conversations disappeared completely. The Admiral acknowledged nobody. Not the captains waiting near the entrance. Not the commanders standing at attention. Not the officers who had spent weeks preparing for his visit. Instead, he stepped into the room and immediately began looking across the crowd. His eyes moved from table to table, across rows of sailors, across serving stations. Searching, the silence became almost physical. Then he found him, standing behind the serving line with a ladle in one hand and an apron tied around his waist. Frank Donovan. The Admiral stopped walking. Completely. The room seemed to stop with him. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. For several long seconds, Admiral Hayes simply stared. The expression on his face shifted through emotions too quickly for most people to understand. Surprise. Disbelief. Recognition. Something deeper. Something personal. Lieutenant Kyle Mercer glanced around nervously. This was not how inspections were supposed to begin. Hayes slowly changed direction. Instead of heading toward the prepared inspection route, he walked directly through the center of the mess hall. Sailors stepped aside. Officers moved out of his path. Nobody needed to be told. The Admiral never took his eyes off Frank. Behind the serving line, Frank finally looked up. Their eyes met. The old veteran's expression remained calm, but a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, as though he had just recognized an old friend in a crowded room. The Admiral reached the counter. Nobody could hear a sound. The industrial kitchen seemed silent. The ventilation fan seemed silent. Hundreds of people watched without breathing. Hayes looked at Frank. Then his gaze lowered toward the exposed tattoo. The faded circle. The weathered star. For a moment, the Admiral said nothing at all. His eyes remained fixed on the symbol. Then something happened that nobody in the room expected. Admiral Richard Hayes slowly removed his cover. His hand trembled slightly. Not from fear. From emotion. Several officers exchanged stunned glances. They had served with him for years. Few had ever seen that expression. Hayes looked back at Frank. I never thought I would see that mark again. The words were barely above a whisper. Yet in the absolute silence, everyone heard them. Frank's smile widened slightly. It has been a while. The Admiral shook his head slowly. 40 years seemed to pass across his face. 40 years, he said. 40 years, and I still could not believe the photograph. Around them, confusion spread through the room. Sailors looked at one another. Officers exchanged bewildered expressions. Nobody understood what they were witnessing. Chief Petty Officer Ethan Ross felt his heart pounding. Even he had not expected this. The Admiral continued staring at the tattoo, then at Frank, then back at the tattoo, as though confirming a memory he had carried for decades. Finally, Admiral Hayes took a slow breath. His voice became steadier, stronger. You disappeared. Frank shrugged gently. Life happened. A faint laugh escaped the Admiral. The sound carried more emotion than most speeches. Then he took one step closer to the serving counter. The entire room leaned forward without realizing it, because everyone sensed the same thing. Whatever came next was about to change everything they thought they knew about the quiet old man who had been serving lunch only minutes before. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence hanging over the mess hall felt heavier than any command ever given. Admiral Richard Hayes stood only a few feet from Frank Donovan, studying the man as though he had stepped out of another lifetime. Around them, sailors, officers, and civilian employees watched in complete confusion. Lieutenant Kyle Mercer felt his stomach tighten. The confidence that had carried him all afternoon was disappearing fast. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The Admiral slowly looked around the room. His eyes settled briefly on the gathered officers, then on the sailors standing frozen beside their tables. Finally, he returned his attention to Frank. Do any of you know who this man is? Hayes asked quietly. No one answered. The Admiral nodded as if he expected that response. That does not surprise me. He looked toward the tattoo again. Because the people who wore that symbol were never looking for recognition. The room remained perfectly silent. Frank lowered his eyes slightly. The faint smile remained. Admiral Hayes took a slow breath. 40 years ago, before I ever wore stars on my shoulders, before I commanded ships, before I sat in briefing rooms and signed reports, I was a very young officer who thought he understood leadership. His voice carried across the room effortlessly. Then I met 5 men who taught me what service actually looked like. Several officers exchanged glances. Kyle felt the blood draining from his face. Hayes continued. That symbol was never an official unit insignia. It never appeared on a roster. It never appeared in public records. It represented 5 servicemen who spent years solving problems nobody else could solve and helping people who could never repay them. The Admiral paused. His eyes remained locked on Frank. Today, only one of those 5 remains. A ripple moved through the crowd. Nobody spoke, but everyone felt it. The weight of the revelation. The old man serving food was not some forgotten retiree. He was the final living member of a story nobody in the room had ever heard. Hayes stepped closer. Frank Donovan spent his entire life helping others and asking for nothing in return. Long after his service ended, he continued serving his community, mentoring young veterans, volunteering where he was needed, and quietly making lives better. The Admiral shook his head softly, and he never once asked anyone to remember his name. Frank looked mildly embarrassed by the attention. That alone seemed to affect the Admiral even more. Then something happened that nobody would forget. Admiral Richard Hayes stood perfectly straight. His shoulders squared. His expression became solemn. And in front of every person inside the mess hall, he rendered a formal salute. The sound that followed was not applause, not cheering. Silence. Complete and absolute silence. The sailors stared. The officers stared. Lieutenant Kyle Mercer felt rooted to the floor. Moments earlier, he had been making jokes about a tattoo. Now one of the most senior leaders in the United States Navy stood saluting the man who wore it. Frank looked at the Admiral for a moment before quietly returning the gesture. No drama. No speech. Just mutual respect carried across decades. Slowly, one by one, sailors throughout the room rose to their feet. Then more followed. Then more. Within seconds, the entire mess hall was standing. Nobody had been ordered to do it. Nobody needed instructions. Chief Petty Officer Ethan Ross watched the scene unfold and understood something important. The tattoo had never been the story. The story was the man who carried it without demanding recognition. Admiral Hayes finally lowered his salute. A faint smile appeared on his face. It is good to see you again, Frank. Frank nodded once. Good to see you too, Richard. A few surprised laughs broke the tension. The Admiral laughed as well. For the first time all afternoon, the room could breathe again. Outside, the flags above the base moved gently in the Virginia breeze. Inside, hundreds of people stood in respectful silence around an old veteran who had spent the day serving lunch. Some people spend a lifetime trying to be remembered. Others simply live with honor. And somehow, those are the names that time never forgets.